so much, Ustaz Masood, for inviting me to be here. And it is, of course, an honor also for me to be in the company of distinguished colleagues and friends. I have known Habib for a long time, and he, I think, to a large extent, has been responsible for a little bit of knowledge that I have about Tunisia. I came to Tunisia immediately after the revolution happened, and since then, and since then I have been coming. And so therefore, if I have any judgment, the wrong judgment about my understanding of Tunisia, you should blame Habib. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Already there has been a significant contribution here about Tunisia historically, and also in terms of the contemporary situation by both of my colleagues. What I will do today in this presentation will not be about why these revolutions, whether in Tunisia, Egypt, or sorry,
Or Yemen?
No, not Yemen. Yemen, that's right. It took place. I mean, I can speak about them if you ask me, but rather I would like to put these Arab uprisings and the development that happened afterwards in a more historical, comparative perspective, so that, in my view, we can have perhaps a better understanding of the particular characteristics that these revolutions hold. So, of course, we know that it happened first here in Tunisia, and that's so significant to me as a question as to why it happened here first. In fact, I was not frankly interested in Tunisia before the revolution. I have to admit that. But when it happened, this revolution, I became very interested. And the question for me was, how come it happened in, in this society? So I, tried to follow and understand. But then, of course, it came Egypt, and then Tunisia, Libya, and so on. On the whole, as you know, some 19 Arab states experienced mass revolts. In the course of a short span of time, 4 dictators toppled, and 1 came to the brink. Bashar al-Assad probably will remain. But especially the rest of the states in the region, in particular the monarchies of the Gulf, got really scared and began to dispense, trying to buy off opposition, or try to sabotage, actually, revolutions that had already taken place elsewhere, so that they could, in fact, delegitimize those revolutions.
Could you change my...
Delegitimize those revolutions precisely in order to maintain status quo in their own societies. Now here, I will focus more on Egypt, Tunisia, and to some extent Yemen. Syria and Libya is a different stories because of the incredible intervention of external forces that they have taken different dynamics. Now, I had lived through. I'm actually old enough to have lived through 2 revolutionary episodes. One was the episode of late 1970s, 1979 especially, the revolution. At the time I was young, student, and in fact participated in it. And at the same time, the Iranian Revolution happened. A couple of months later, a revolution in Nicaragua happened, the Sandinistas revolution. And then, after so many years, I experienced revolutions in the Arab world, in particular when I had actually lived in Egypt prior to its revolution for many years, actually about 16 years or so, and I was a bit familiar with the Arab world, had traveled and so on. Now, as I eagerly observed the Arab revolutions unfolding, I became really increasingly perplexed as to how much these revolutions were different from the ones that I had experienced and studied. I had studied also the Iranian and Nicaraguan revolution earlier. I realized that the Arab revolutions were very different. To begin with, the Arab uprisings were happening in the region, especially the Arab world, where the conventional wisdom, especially social political scientists, had seen is an unchanging world, right? So the change will not come to the Middle East because of its cultural reasons, because of this, what is called the authoritarian durability, something that the political scientists were actually analyzing. Secondly, but in fact, it did happen, right, in these very societies, and surprised everyone, and surprised even the protagonists, even the actors themselves. It surprised the revolutionaries. Secondly, they were created by and large by ordinary people, in the way that Habib was talking about Bouazizi and others in Sidi Bouzid and many other places in the marginalized areas, both I think in Egypt and Tunisia. Provincial areas actually began, of course, first. So they really began by ordinary people with no charismatic leaders, no unified organization, no specific ideology, no any kind of intellectual precursor or anchor, no Lenin, no Trotsky, no Khomeini, no Ali Shariati, or Václav Havel, or Mandela, and so on. Thirdly, all were unfolded by spectacular mobilization and mass revolts. The amazing mass revolt that actually surprised the world in the streets and the squares, in Maidans, so that Maidan actually became a meme in the global, of course, Occupy movement, and 500 movements that happened around the world somewhat emulated the kind of square politics that had happened largely in the Arab world, especially in Tahrir Square. And actually I have written about this global dimension of Tahrir in a piece that hopefully it will come out soon. And yet, these revolutions really caused little break from the old order, especially in terms of the institutions of the incumbent states. And I have suggested that I have suggested that these revolutions perhaps were rich, very rich as movement, but quite poor in terms of change. So revolutions, of course, have two aspects: movement and change. It is a combination of these two that actually make up a revolution. And by the way, let me say what I mean by revolution. To me, revolutions, judging from the 20th century experiences, and even the earlier, refers to societal changes that begins with a rapid and radical transformation of the state, pushed by popular movements from below. So to me, revolutions are societal changes that begins with rapid and radical transformation of the state, pushed by popular movements from below. So if this is the case, in the case of the Arab Revolution, how do we interpret it? I've suggested that the Arab revolutions are peculiar kind of revolutions, or peculiar kind of political happenings, quite different from the ones that happened in the 20th century, like the Cuban Revolution, the Nicaraguan, Iranian, and so forth. I think that in fact, the trajectory of the Arab revolutions, to me, were neither a reform nor a revolution in the sense that I have understood. I have called it a revolution, the mix of reform and revolution. But let me say that this term revolution, actually used first, not by me, but by Garton Ash, who is a historian at Oxford University, and he was referring to the Eastern European Revolution of 1989. But his concept is very different, or rather my concept is very different. I mean, he's referring actually to real revolution, but peaceful ones, negotiated revolutions. Whereas what I'm understanding is quite different, and I will explain. Okay. So it was neither a reform or a revolution in the sense of the 20th century. As you know, in a reform, as happened in the transition from dictatorship to democracy in Latin America, you have a social movement that pushes the states to come to the negotiation table, and they agree on a kind of social or political pact, and transition in a long period of time actually happens, right? In the revolution, again, according to experiences, revolutionary movements builds up and mobilizes, gather momentum, and at some point develop to such an extent that it generates kind of a dual power. And in that dual power, you have the power of the street, power of people on the one hand, and power of the incumbent states on the other hand. That this dual power has to be resolved either through negotiation, as happened in Poland, or in fact by mere force to actually replace the incumbent and generate new states, new organs of power, and new personnel, and basically generate new state institutions and so on. This happened in most of these revolutions that happened in the 20th century. But none of these kind of the trajectories were available or were seen as such in the Arab revolutions that I am referring to. So in this sense, I'm saying they were a revolution. That is, they were the revolutionary movements that emerged to compel the existing orders, existing regime, to reform themselves. They were not seeking, in fact, to replace the incumbent states, but rather asking, or rather pushing the incumbent states to reform themselves, to have a new constitution, elections, and so on and so forth. So, well, I mean, if this is the strategy, then the incumbent regimes may or may not change, because there are vested interests. The institutions might or might not change themselves, and often they do not, because they have interests. And unless they come to a conclusion and with cost-benefit analysis, that actually it is better for us to change to at least hold some power than not to change. And also depends upon how their calculation is about the power of the street or power of the revolutionary movement. I think as a consequence, not much really change in terms of the organs of the state power. In particular in Egypt, I understand that in Tunisia, now we have an electoral democracy, and that's very, very significant. But in terms of social economic order, we've seen quite a continuity from the past. Now, why? The question for me was why was this was the case? In particular, why was that the protagonists, those people who actually began these uprisings, remained largely on the margins of power rather than on the center of power? Why was that? I think partially they will remain on the margins of power because they did not want to take actually power in the first place. But when at some point in the process of revolutionary mobilization they realized that they should, but then it was in some way too late because they didn't have enough resources, that is enough powerful organization, powerful leadership, or some degree of hard power to be able to wrest power from the incumbents. Consequently, to a large degree, the institutions of power largely remained. These are, of course, in the immediate post-revolution. But still, again, the question is why we had this trajectory in the Arab revolutions. I think Arab revolutions happened in a global time, global ideological time, when the very idea of revolution had been discredited. Revolutions happened in a very global time, a very ideological time, in which the very idea of revolution had been dissipated. People were not talking about revolution anymore. They were talking about something else if they really desire change. Let me explain this. Up until 1990s or mid-90s, there were three ideological sort of movements or ideologies that carried the idea of revolution as a deep structural change. The first one was, of course, anti-colonial nationalism. I mean, by this I mean the ideas refer to the writings of nationalism, but kind of radical nationalism, anti-colonial nationalism, writers like Fanon, Ho Chi Minh, and others, who saw kind of post-colonial state as something fundamentally different from the societies which were under colonial rule. Well, there's a long story as what happened to these post-colonial nationalists. A lot of them, unfortunately, did not deliver, although they brought significant changes in state formation, class formation, especially forming the middle classes and so on. But by and large, they really failed to materialize the kind of things that they had promised, whether it is democracy or development. But anyway, anti-colonial nationalism really ended when colonialism, at least in the formal sense, really ended. Perhaps Palestine remains one of the last examples of where still colonial rule in some way remains, and for them nationalism or national struggle is an important one. The second ideology, of course, was Marxism, in particular Marxist-Leninism, that we all know that the idea, the concept of revolution was central to this ideology, and that informed many different kind of leftist, socialist, communist organizations that existed both in the West, whether it is Trotskyist, the Fourth International and others, or even the communist parties and socialist parties in the developing world. But this changed. This changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. In fact, the idea of revolution was integral to socialism and communist ideology. With the decline of that ideology, the idea of revolution also ebbed and declined. So the very idea of revolution became a liability. In fact, in post-colonial times, post-Cold War era, shall we say in the 1990s or early 2000, I mean, people were not talking about revolution those people who talked were considered to be dinosaurs, old-timers and so on. The discourse has dramatically changed. So instead of the ideas of socialism, state, or revolution, we saw an explosion in the ideas of individual, of market, of civil society, which actually was reduced merely to NGOs, or rational dialogue, or nonviolence, and reform. Reform, actually, gradual change, gradual legal change, really became the name of the game. So of course these ideas very much, I think, propagated and pushed forward by international organizations and so on, which all I'm sure you know. And the third was, the third ideology that carried the idea of revolution was militant Islamism. Although Marxism, Leninism had declined, but its key rival in the Middle East, and that was militant Islamism, had survived and it still was carrying the idea of revolution in a very Leninist form. You know, the seizure of seizure of the state. I mean, well, I'll talk about it in Iran later. I mean, in Iran, for Islamists, they were very much Leninistic in the sense that we take power, change the state, and then unleash Islamization from above. This is exactly what they did. So since 1970s, as you know, militant Islamist movements had drawn on the revolutionary ideology, ideas of Sayyid Qutb to fight against secular states in the Muslim world. As you know, Qutb was influenced by the Indian Islamist Abul Ala Maududi, who himself had been very much influenced by certain ideas of Communist Party of India. And in fact, he was living, his roommate was a communist poet, and they were discussing Leninist ideas of organization. So in this sense, in some way, Leninism actually moved, from, Leninist ideas moved from Abul Ala Maududi into Sayyid Qutb and into basically the ideology of Islamism in terms of wanting to see a revolution. So the Iranian Revolution itself was both informed by the Marxist idea of revolution, as well as influences from Sayyid Qutb. In fact, Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the supreme leader today, he translated Sayyid Qutb's book, Ma'arif Tariq, and it existed just before the revolution, but it wasn't known very much. I didn't know about it, but it was known among themselves. But I think more important was the idea of Ali Shariati. You might know him, who was a very significant intellectual who tried to mix Shia Islam and Marxist revolutionism to create an indigenous theory of revolution. And it became very influential. And that informed very much the ideology of a lot of revolutionaries like myself at the time. So therefore, revolution has been really central to politics of militant Islamism. But I believe that this also began to change with the crisis of Islamism in the 1990s, especially after 9/11, and the kind of decline, in my view, of the popularity of militant Islamism among Muslim masses. We saw the emergence, what I've called post-Islamism, that tried to maintain an Islamist polity, but work within the system, work within the incumbent through legal means, and try to actually work with the some values of the electoral democracy. Post-Islamists, by definition, are post-revolutionaries. That is, they don't believe in actually revolution. They believe in gradual change. And the examples are Iranian reformist, Mr. Khatami, who was the president in Iran, or AKP for some years, or what is happening in Indonesia, or in my view, perhaps Al-Nahda, and I know that a colleague is working on this issue. Economically, unlike the Islamism of the past, which had been influenced by socialist ideas, distributionism, post-Islamists largely are very comfortable with free market and neoliberalism. Yeah? In fact, post-Islamist ideas are in tune with the prevailing concept and idea of post-Cold War period. So the key concepts for them is ideas of accountability, democracy, globalization, market, and so on and so forth. So the Arab revolutions happened in this context, right? In this background of, in fact, a crisis in a sense of ideologies that had carried the idea of revolution. So the Arab protagonists, those who initiated the uprising so impressively, in my view, were not in tune to the idea of revolution in the way that other militants and other activists around the world were not in tune with the idea of revolution. In the late 1970s, when I was a little student, me and myself used to go around, and I was a very sensitive person. I had a kind of very rural background, poor background, and so on. But when we moved to Tehran, I was very much sensitive about seeing all these very posh neighborhoods and big villas and so on. And we used to go around, and really, we used to say, well, in the revolution, we are going to distribute this mansion to the poor, or take over the palace, and so on. So in other words, we were uttering the language of revolution, a radical change. But I think in the Arab world of late 2000, there were really few groups, or perhaps little groups really, who actually uttering such languages of fundamental change. So largely, the protagonists were in favor of inclusion rather than transformation. So the consequence was that it really what happened was neither reform nor revolution, or what I've called revolution. But revolutions, that is, for instance, in Tunisia, has also advantages. There are good things about them as well. First of all, there is less disruption and destructions. Often life goes on, and a lot of people perhaps receive their salaries, there are electricity, water, maybe with some disruptions and so on. It's very different from what happened, for instance, in Iran or Nicaragua, that there was a massive disruption, precisely because of the doings of the revolutionaries themselves, who wanted to create disruption in order to achieve the revolution. And that's, of course, one of the contradictions of revolutions. Secondly, but in the case of the Arab revolt, largely was more or less peaceful and more kind of orderly, which is a good thing. But secondly, these can be more, they can be more, of course, less violence, and more importantly, or equally importantly, there could be more pluralism. There could be more pluralism, which could be a foundation for actually building some kind of a electoral democracy. You see, in the revolution of the 20th century, when the revolutionary movements would emerge and come to power, they will build on their political capital and basically declare themselves as the fathers of a revolution. We have done the revolution, and other people should shut up, right? So they would actually easily could eliminate the opposition and so on, and therefore you could have really non-democracy. This is what happened in Iran. But I think this could not really happen in the revolution, precisely because by and large revolutionaries are not in power as such. And secondly, because there are a variety of forces that can check them. And those forces includes the forces from the previous regimes, pre-revolutionary forces, right? The media, the network, the organizations, and so on. So in Tunisia, you had so many political parties that emerged just after the revolution that had aligned with the previous regime, right? So there's a plurality of views that can prevent monopolization of power. And in this sense, could be something useful to build electoral democracy. But precisely because the people and institutions of the old order continue to operate, there is always the danger of counter-revolution. There's always the danger of counter-revolution. And whether it is sudden through coup d'etat or gradually through gradual restoration of the old values, old order, old networks, and so on and so forth. So the challenge, therefore, is how to maintain pluralism and inclusion and yet make the new democratic rule resistance to counter-revolutionary restoration. I think Tunisia and Egypt had this trajectory. I think Tunisia managed to maintain a degree of pluralism, which has, and electoral democracy. I think this, in my humble judgment, had to do with a broad coalition that was possible here, was made by Nahda and the labor unions and secular forces, whereas in Egypt, the Islamists, to me, Nahda has had this capacity to be inclusive, to be able to negotiate with others and share power with others. Whereas Muslim Brothers did not have this capacity. They are exclusively Islamists. They didn't play with the seculars. And the seculars in Egypt also did not play with Muslim Brothers either. They never trusted them. Consequently, the opposition to the old order was split. And the old order, that is a counter-revolution, took advantage of the split within the opposition to actually stage a coup. And finally, I think that's the point that I want to make is a very important point, at least for myself, that the story of revolution is not just what happens in the state level, in these institutions of the regimes or regime change. However, however crucial the institutions of the state is, I acknowledge it's very, very significant. But revolution is not just about what happens at the level of the state. The story of revolution is also what happens in the grassroots, what happens on the ordinary people, in the neighborhoods, in the factories, in the farms. Yeah? And this is extremely significant because here it shows a revolution in terms of really an event, something new, an opportunity that people at the bottom can generate new, novel institutions in their own immediate surroundings. And this is actually something that I'm really working on. So I stop here and perhaps we'll have more discussion if you have. Sorry about my long